As I think most of y'all have figured out by now, I'm kind of a sucker for comic book superheroes. And even though my favorite is and will always be the Batman, I'm certainly not above checking out Captain America or Black Panther, Superman or Wonder Woman. And that's probably why I was looking forward to seeing Shazam back in the spring. Of course, because of all of the legal stuff centered around copyright infringement, and it goes back to the 40s, that's what they call the guy now, Shazam. But you know, he'll always be Captain Marvel to me. Anyway, I saw the movie, and I've got to tell you, it was great. But not just because of the special effects. I really thought the story was good and really had an important message for everybody. Of course, that means absolutely nothing if you're not a superhero nerd like me. And so let me give you a little backstory about Shazam, aka Captain Marvel. Because of a whole bunch of stuff we really don't have time to deal with now, a boy, and he was a boy, named Billy Batson was given the ability to become Captain Marvel by saying the word Shazam. And according to the movie, although his body and outfit changed, his strength and power increased, his mind and maturity didn't. And so what you end up with is a superhero who thinks like a 13-year-old boy. And you know, that contrast is really the focus of the movie. Of course, this idea crosses over into morality along with everything else. Because Billy, Shazam, Captain Marvel, has to decide whether he's going to use his power for himself, you know, to earn a little spending money or to show off for the people around him, or actually to help others. And with that as the fundamental dilemma, he ends up recognizing that what he's been given should be used for a greater good and not just possessed for his own benefit. And that's really the lesson of the movie. And I'll tell you, even though I don't think his name ever comes up, I believe this kind of message would put a smile on Jesus' face. Because I think that's really what's going on in the parable we're looking at this morning. You see, after giving his story about two different kinds of soils and the story of the mustard seed and the story of the indifferent and ignorant farmer, according to Mark, Jesus just went about his business of healing and casting out demons and performing a bunch of other miracles. Now, that's what he continued to do. But then somewhere right in the middle of his Gospels, he shifted gears and started talking like this. Jesus began telling his disciples what would happen to him. He said, the nation's leaders and the chief priests and the teachers of the law of Moses will make the Son of Man suffer terribly. He will be rejected and killed, but 3 days later he will rise to life. Then Jesus explained clearly what he meant. Now, that's what he said to anyone who would listen. Therefore, it shouldn't be surprising that the crowds began to lose interest, especially since he pretty much stopped healing, curing the sick, or stilling storms, or passing out free filet or fish sandwiches. And it was right before he shared his last meal with his disciples that he told the parable we're looking at this morning. And just like we've done in the last 3 weeks, we're going to approach it by focusing on the story itself, and focusing on the meaning, and then focusing on the application. But unlike what we've done in the past, we're going to listen to what he said as we focus on the story. You see, I think this is how the action breaks down. And it starts with a guy planting a vineyard. Jesus then told them this story. A farmer once planted a vineyard. He built a wall around it and dug a pit to crush the grapes in. He also built a lookout tower. He rented out his vineyard and left the country. Now, we're going to talk about what this might mean a little bit later. And so we've got an operation that was set up for success, don't we? I mean, I want you to think about it. We got grapes, right? And we got a wine press. We've got walls and a lookout tower so nobody can come in and attack us. But we've also got an absentee landowner, don't we? Who's built all this stuff, and a bunch of tenants, sharecroppers, who've been given the chance to work in exchange for a share of the crop. And all went well until the harvest. According to Jesus, when it was harvest time, he sent a servant to get his share of the grapes. The renters grabbed the servant, beat him up, and sent him away without a thing. The owner sent another servant, but the renters beat him on the head and insulted him terribly. Then the man sent another servant, and they killed him. He kept sending servant after servant. They beat some and killed others. The owner had a son he loved very much. Finally, he sent the son to the renters because he thought they would respect him. But they said to themselves, someday he will own the vineyard. Let's kill him. That way we can have it all for ourselves. So they grabbed the owner's son and killed him. Then they threw his body out of the vineyard. Now, I think it's important to understand the owner didn't want the whole crop, just his share. But the renters didn't want to give him anything. And so when the owner sent a servant to collect what really belonged to him, the tenants beat the first two, and then they killed the third, and so on, alternating beating and killing lucky servants. And finally, the owner came up with what he thought was a great idea. Rather than send more servants, I mean, it's hard to get people to work for him. I don't know what he would put in the Jerusalem Times as an ad for help wanted, servant may be beaten or killed. Rather than send any more of them, he'd send his beloved son, because certainly the renters would respect him and give the owner what he was entitled. Of course, he overestimated the intelligence of his sharecroppers. You see, they made an interesting assumption. They assumed that if they killed the son, they'd get it all. In other words, with the son out of the way, they'd take legal possession of property they were treating as their own anyway, and the owner would do absolutely nothing. And so that's what they did. They killed the son and tossed his body over the wall. Of course, everyone who heard this knew the tenants were acting like idiots. And that's why Jesus asked, what do you think the owner of the vineyard will do? He will come and kill those renters and let someone else have his vineyard. You surely know that scriptures say the stone that the builders tossed aside is now the most important stone of all. This is something the Lord has done, and it is amazing to us. Now, that's what happened, right? And as to some of the images that seem to be important, well, I think the first in line is the vineyard. I mean, that's where it all happens. But along with this location, we also have some characters in the story that are worth looking at. Like the farmer and the sharecroppers and all those poor servants who came, and of course the son of the owner. And as to the actions, what did Jesus have in mind when he talked about leasing rather than giving? And what was the share the owner wanted to collect? And why did these sharecroppers beat and kill the servants and assume they could take possession once they killed the son? Now, these are some of the images we might want to consider. And finally, as to results, the conclusion, what did the owner killing the squatters and getting new tenants, what did that have to do with this business about the most important stone? Inquiring minds want to know. At least that's what we need to find out after we focused on the story, right? But I'll tell you, I think we get a lot of those questions answered when we focus on the meaning, the second step. Of course, the evangelist Mark gave us some pretty good insight when he wrote, the leaders knew that Jesus was really talking about them, and they wanted to arrest him, but because they were afraid of the crowd, they let him alone and left. So we get the idea that this story was directed at the Jewish leaders. And so with that in mind, what might the different images mean? And I'll tell you, we're in luck because the most important image is the easiest to interpret. You see, the idea of a vineyard has deep roots in the Old Testament, where it usually represents a place where God blesses his people. For example, just listen to the prophet Isaiah. The Lord said, I will sing a song about my friend's vineyard that was on the side of a fertile hill. My friend dug the ground, removed the stones, and planted the best vines. He built a watchtower and dug a pit in rocky ground for pressing the grapes. He hoped they would be sweet, but bitter grapes were all it produced. Listen, people of Jerusalem and of Judah. You are the judge of me and my vineyard. What more could I have done for my vineyard? I hoped for sweet grapes, but bitter grapes were all that grew. I am Lord all-powerful. Israel is the vineyard, and Judah is the garden I tended with care. I had hoped for honesty and for justice, but dishonesty and cries for mercy were all I found. And so let's say the vineyard represents the people of the promise and the place where the promise is made real. That's what the vineyard means. And the farmer, the owner, well, that would sure seem to be God. And the sharecroppers, his people. In the past, the Jewish people. But rather than seeing what they have as a blessing, what they've been given as a blessing, one that they might use to benefit themselves, but also God and others, they saw those blessings as something they could possess and exploit just for themselves. They didn't care about what God wanted, they cared about themselves. And because of that, when God simply wanted them to do the two things he commanded, they balked. And what did God want? Well, I think Jesus explained that when he said this soon after offering this parable. One of the teachers of the law of Moses came up while Jesus and the Sadducees were arguing. When they heard Jesus give a good answer, he asked him, what's the most important commandment? Jesus answered, the most important one says, people of Israel, you have only one Lord in God. You must love him with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. The second most important commandment says, love others as much as you love yourself. No other commandment is more important than these. Now, that's what God wanted. But when he sent prophets to remind the people of what they were expected to do, what was the response? What was the response when the prophets came with their message? Message calling for the people to love one another and to be compassionate and merciful and to be honest and to practice justice. What was the response? Well, they beat some and killed others. And even when God sent his beloved Son, and we know who he is, they killed him because they assumed that doing that would put them in control. But as it turned out, that assumption was obviously stupid, because they underestimated the importance of the Son that they intentionally rejected and killed. In fact, he was the most important stone in the pile, the one that would be put in the corner. And because of their arrogant action, God's promises and his blessings would extend to a new people. In other words, those who used to be on the outside looking over the wall, they would become the ones who'd be given the opportunity to work in God's kingdom and the responsibility to present him their fruits of love and compassion, of mercy and grace. And that's why the story really ticked off the Jewish leaders. They were about to lose their exclusive lease. You see, when we focus on the meaning, for me, that's the most likely conclusion. But then how might we apply this meaning to Christians, both then and now? Of course, back in the day, I can imagine this parable offered all kinds of hope and excitement to those first century believers who were brand new to the faith. I mean, it reminded them that in spite of their backgrounds, in spite of their small numbers, in spite of their struggles, it reminded them that God had given all they needed to bear fruit, to love him and to love others. Therefore, now was the time to roll up their sleeves so that they could present a portion of their harvest to the Lord. I'm telling you, for them, this is a story of hope, a story of encouragement, a story of grace. And although it can be the same for us living 2,000 years later, at least for me, well, it also challenges me to consider how I see the vineyard. How I see the blessings that we now have. How I see what God has given to us. And in other words, this story causes me to ask myself all kinds of questions. For example, do we really appreciate the wonderful things that God has given us? My gosh, God has been good to us. He's given us all that we need. Do we appreciate that, or are we more comfortable complaining because we want more? And do we actually believe that everything we have has been given so that we might produce something more important? You know, the kind of fruit God wants us to produce. And are we treating those who challenge us to love God and to love one another, are we treating them just like the ancient Jews treated the prophets and ultimately the Son? Simply put, do our assumptions and do our actions have more to do with the old tenants or with their replacements? Now, these are a few of the questions that are bouncing around in my head as I focus on applying this parable to myself. You see, just like Billy, Shazam, Captain Marvel had to determine how he was going to use his new powers, in light of this story, we need to decide how we're going to use the blessings we've been given. And even though I don't believe our decision will influence or change our eternal destiny, man, that's in the hands of God and was decided on before he laid the foundation of the universe, it sure will shape what we do and how we feel until we get there. And this is something we know because of the parable of the wicked tenants. And next week we'll finish up this series on the parables in Mark with the story of the faithful servant. Amen.